Power, Progress, and Punishment in Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Foucault's insights by looking at prisons and the evolution of discipline on the notion of power and how punishment can instill things that we take for granted. We'll begin by briefly outlining Foucault's influences historically and his project in general. We'll highlight some of Nietzsche's influence, and then we'll move into comparing, in broad strokes, torture versus modern prisons. Talk about why we punish in the first place. Explain the downfall of torture. And finally, move into analyzing penal technopolitics. Michel Foucault was born in Poitiers, France, on the 15th of October, 1926. And he's a very interesting philosopher because you could call him a historian in many ways. And Foucault himself said that his project was basically l'Archaeology du savoir, an archaeology of knowledge, where he looks at things that we assume have always been this way. And we actually unearth them in their historical context. Things like punishment, or the idea of madness, or the notion of being sick. All of these bear on the ways in which we interact with people. And Foucault says that power often, when we think it is the least involved in our lives, is actually the most involved and subtly manipulates in very important ways our possibilities of expression. And he's concerned with the question, who are we and how did we get here? You might notice in there is no who ought we be, but what are we? Who are we? What are we situated within? So he's influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, who is going to give him a lot of his anti-transcendent and anti-state and power-centered tendencies. He's also influenced by the Marquis de Sade, that's where we get the word sadism from. And Marquis de Sade was very famous for writing these libertine novels, which got him imprisoned. He died in a mental institution, I believe. He wrote most of his works while he was imprisoned, among many places, in the Bastille. And Marquis de Sade was famous for just pushing the limits of the kind of gruesome stuff you could put into prose. I mean, rape, torture, infanticide, anything you can think of, Marquis de Sade put it in his writing. And that is to say, this lecture is X-rated for sure, so be warned. And then finally, he was definitely influenced, among other French philosophers and thinkers in general, by Antonin Artaud, who was a French playwright. He came up with The Body Without Organs, for example, which Deleuze and Guattari love. And he loves kind of the theme of the death of God, man as machine, and he was just really radical in rethinking the way we think about the contemporary period. And one of Foucault's most important ideas is that power and knowledge are inextricably linked. That the type of knowledge we have about something is connected to the way power relations allow that knowledge to come about. And Foucault infamously died of AIDS at the age of 57. This was initially hidden from the public, and I believe it was supposed to be a brain abnormality or something caused him to die, is at least what was said, and then it was later explained that it was of AIDS. And Foucault was concerned with unearthing the constructed or the contingent nature of institutions or ideas that we take for granted. Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most important influences on Foucault, And he has a number of ideas which I've covered to various degrees on this channel, and which you can feel free to check out. One of these is being beyond good and evil. That was the title of one of Nietzsche's works. And Nietzsche says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "A tablet of the good hangs over every people. Behold, it is the tablet of their overcomings. Behold, it is the voice of their will to power. Whatever makes them rule and conquer and shine to the dread and envy of their neighbors, that is to them the high, the first, the measure, the meaning of all things." Which is to say, what we take to be good is actually tied up in what allows us to survive, what we all find mutually beneficial, what we find mutually interesting or acceptable. And thus, good and evil is obviously a normative judgment, which is tied to a specific cultural context. And thus, no idea of good and evil is eternal, because every people is not only a geographical distinction, but it's a temporal distinction. Throughout history, French society will have different things be acceptable and permissible, or gross and barbaric. And in addition to this, Nietzsche had a big influence on truth as an essentially non-absolute and shifting phenomenon. That the truth itself was free. That there is no the truth, in fact, but rather a bunch of subjectively situated truths. He has this very interesting imagery, also in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he says that an eagle swept through the air in wide circles, and on it hung a serpent. Not like a prey, but like a friend, for it kept itself coiled round the eagle's neck. So, of course, the eagle is symbolizing freedom, and the serpent, knowledge. And they are one in the same, that all sure claims are fleeting and on the way, and thus, really what is most true is that which is in conjunction with freedom, which is to say action. And this generally culminates in a process metaphysics. Once again, from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, "To assume the right to new values, that is the most formidable assumption for a load-bearing and reverent spirit. Verily, unto such a spirit it is praying, and the work of a beast of prey." And we see that imagery of the beast of prey is going to be very similar to those themes played on by the Marquis de Sade. And this is going to call upon Foucault to create new values, as Zarathustra says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And it's going to call one to examine institutions and have a very liberatory mentality towards everything that is right now. Now, in Discipline and Punish, we have two different forms of discipline and punish. We have torture and prison. Now, I'm going to read some of the opening chapter of Discipline and Punish, in which we have a very detailed explication of torture. I quote from page 3. "On the 2nd of March, 1757, Damien the regicide was condemned to make the amende honorable before the main door of the Church of Paris, where he was to be taken and conveyed in a cart, wearing nothing but a shirt, holding a torch of burning wax weighing 2 pounds. Then, in the said cart, to the Place de Grève, where, on a scaffold that will be erected there, the flesh will be torn from his breasts, arms, thighs, and calves with red-hot pincers. His right hand, holding the knife with which he condemned the said parricide, burnt with sulphur, and on those places where the flesh will be torn away, poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, wax, and sulphur melted together, and then his body drawn and quartered by 4 horses, and his limbs and body consumed by fire, reduced to ashes, and his ashes thrown to the wind." In contrast to this very gruesome and In fact, it mentions throughout that section, which certain parts I didn't read, that this actually took a really long time, and it wasn't very precise. They needed to add 2 more horses because they tried to pull his limbs off with horses, and the horses weren't strong enough, and they gave up and they got tired. He wouldn't swear and was insisting that his punishment continue. And in contrast to this, we have 80 years later, and I quote from page 6, Léon Fouché's drawing up of his rules for the house of young prisoners in Paris. Article 17. The prisoner's day will begin at 6 in the morning in winter and at 5 in summer. They will work for 9 hours a day throughout the year. 2 hours a day will be devoted to instruction. Work and the day will end at 9 o'clock in winter and at 8 in summer. Article 18. Rising. At the first drum roll, the prisoners must rise and dress in silence as the supervisor opens the cell doors. At the second drum roll, they must be dressed and make their beds. At the third, they must line up and proceed to the chapel for morning prayer. There is a 5-minute interval between each drum roll. Article 19. The prayers are conducted by the chaplain and followed by a moral and religious reading. This exercise must not last more than half an hour. And it continues on through Article 28, which lays out in great detail a timetable for what is to be done at each moment and the activities which are to be done. And Foucault mentions that we have then a public execution and a timetable. And we're wondering how we got from place to place. One should keep in mind what stands out about torture and what stands out about carceral discipline. When one reads Discipline and Punish, especially if you're not immediately privy to what Foucault is saying, you might think that this notion of punishment being problematic in general is unfounded. You might say, well, we need punishment. And I think it's important to analyze, why exactly do we punish? What function does it serve? Punishment allows us to substantiate virtues or notions of misdeed or crossing some boundary. And you can uphold this with an apparatus, with a government, with a state, which is capable of enforcing this punishment both bodily and mentally. And ideally, you want to inflict both, but bodily is certainly easier. And when we think about prisons, for example, it's really strange because when a child has a toy taken away by another child, I mean, what do you want to do? You want to hit them. And then you get punished by your teacher for hitting. You get punished for punishing, which is kind of interesting because there's a hierarchy to punishment. Some punishment is allowed and some is not. And as such, it's rather weird to think, instead of inflicting bodily suffering on you, instead of that being the primary method, I'm just going to have you sit in one spot. Just sit there. Maybe I'll have you do some work. Maybe I'll feed you. Maybe I'll teach you some stuff. It's like, what a different way to think about punishment. And in the traditional view of punishment, everyone has this moral consciousness or quote-unquote moral law written on their hearts. That's a common Christianese expression. And this punishment is something that people concede to because it is in line with their moral consciousness. The state punishes a rapist, and we applaud them. A state fails to punish an investment banker, we're kind of like, okay, maybe they should have punished them. But at least they punish the rapist, right? At least they punish the person who kills their mother. And the state in its methods of punishment lines up with our moral consciousness enough that we assume that our moral consciousness comes first, and a state comes about. And this is a very Hobbesian notion, that we come from this state of nature where we're all vying for our self-interests and our survival. And we have ideas of what is right and wrong, and we enter into a society where the state comes after and acquiesces to this moral consciousness. Foucault wants to flip this on its head. The moral consciousness is one of these ideas that we take for granted. Why is it that it's okay for guys to have their shirts off at a beach? Just pure skin, but girls not. And you might say, well, it's because breasts are private parts, quote unquote. What makes them private parts? What makes them not private parts? What makes us prefer certain speech and find other speech inopportune? All of this stuff Foucault wants to say as being created by punishment, by the enforcement of order. If we want to understand what punishment is, we of course have to understand what power is. And Foucault's ideas about power are really interesting because they focus on power as relational, that it's not merely top-down, although it often can be, but that its goal is to be diffuse in the entire social body. This is an excerpt from an interview with André Breton. Breton, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, titled What is Our Present?
Le pouvoir, c'est des relations. Le pouvoir, ce n'est pas une chose. Une relation entre deux individus, et une relation qui est telle que l'un peut conduire la conduite d'un autre, ou déterminer la conduite d'un autre, la déterminer volontairement en fonction d'un certain nombre d'objectifs qui sont les siens. Autrement dit, quand on regarde ce qu'est le pouvoir, c'est l'exercice de quelque chose qu'on peut appeler le gouvernement, au sens très large. On peut gouverner une société, on peut gouverner un groupe, on peut gouverner une communauté, on peut gouverner une famille, on peut gouverner quelqu'un. Et quand je dis gouverner quelqu'un, c'est simplement au sens que l'on peut déterminer sa conduite en fonction de stratégies, en utilisant un certain nombre de tactiques. Donc, si vous voulez, c'est la gouvernementalité, au sens large, entendu donc comme ensemble des relations de pouvoir et techniques qui permettent à ces relations de pouvoir de s'exercer. C'est cela que j'ai...
So back to analyzing punishment and discipline a little bit more clearly. What exactly is our goal in punishment? I mean, this is something people don't always think about, but it's not too crazy to, it's not too conceptual. Imagine you are a sovereign and you have more power than someone else. Maybe you have more social status. Maybe you have more material goods, whatever it may be. We can imagine in a very nomadic situation, almost like a pastoralist situation, certain people having more power and they want to compound it on top of each other. They want more power, right? And you want to keep this power for as long as possible, so you need some kind of way to get people to agree or disagree with your desires. You want them to agree with what you don't like as something they also don't like. And the question is, how do you do this? How do you get everyone, or at least most people, such that you have a majority, to instantaneously and wholeheartedly submit to your authority? You've got two options. And these represent kind of large methods of discipline, which operate in more diffuse ways throughout society. And throughout Discipline and Punish, Foucault is going to point to militaries, schools, clinics, to point out how the strategies that operate in option 2 are actually diffuse throughout our society. But in option 1, we have torture as a spectacle. In this, punishment is about making an example out of someone who refuses to acquiesce. It is necessarily public, and it serves the function of dissuading people from future action via a threat. And the more gruesome you can make this, as with Damiens, it dissuades people. But the problem in terms of achieving our goal is that it is always post hoc. It's always after the fact. And it only serves to subdue subversion. It's not really able to eliminate it from arising. It just makes it where, when the idea of subversion arises in someone's mind, if the spectacle of the torture remains in one's mind and overpowers that sentiment of subversion, then people don't do it. So there's always a lag between the thought of illegality and the thought of punishment. And if we really wanted to optimize punishment, we would want there to be no lag. We would want communication to be so complete that at the very instant that something is deemed illegal, the populace as a whole instantaneously agrees, right? That is the ideal kind of perfect social order, so to speak, from the perspective of the sovereign, is every single person agrees with every single thing you say. And thus there's no need for subversion because nobody disagrees with you. And that might sound really nice. I mean, if you could live in a society where everyone agrees on all these rules and there's no gray area. But the question that's more sinister is exactly how do we get there? So shifting to option 2, we have prison and juridical precision. So the shift goes from spectacle and deterrence to precision and instantaneousness. So punishment is no longer just about physical opposition to criminals. It is an institutionalized recoding of behaviors. And it operates down to the finest detail to prevent the very emergence of illegality at all. There is an instinctive and instantaneous link where the thoughts of the state is basically the thoughts of the people. And this is very reminiscent to an utterance by Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he says that the greatest lie the state says is that I, the state, am the people. This is what the state wants, is for the people to feel as if they are perfectly represented and thus they don't have to fight anymore. And that is the moment of really absolute and totalizing discipline, a state discipline. Now, this might seem like a really stupid question, but why did torture cease to be the default punishment? Why did we go from a very bodily form of punishment to seclusion, labor, optimization of virtues, education? Why did these become forms of punishment instead? Among many of the reasons that torture would succumb to carceral forms of discipline is threefold, basically. And there are more reasons that Foucault outlines in the book, but I'm just picking out some of the ones that I think are the most central. The first is that torture is essentially warlike. It is a battle of epic proportions. It is force versus force, with the intent of creating a spectacle of the sovereign's might, right? The torture is an extension and a representation of the sovereign's absolute power. But what happens when that power isn't enough? As I mentioned with Damiens, the 4 horses weren't enough to pull him limb from limb. They had to add 2 more. And all these little imprecisions, I mean, imagine when this is taking place in the public, and the way Foucault outlines Damien's very visceral torture, it's almost comical. And of course, part of that is coming from the stuff that I didn't read, but Damien is asking by like a religious fellow of some kind to kiss him on the cheek, or he's asking Jesus to forgive him instead of cursing, or the executioner tries to use pincers to pull his skin off, but he's not strong enough to do it. So little moments like these, especially in the public eye, tend to bring out the impotence of the sovereign, rather than merely showing an absolute spectacle. There is at least a possibility that in this power for power, brute for brute form of punishment, that it might not always be 100% on the side of the sovereign. And building off of this, it's imprecise. Formal legal codes detailed all manner of punishments. There were all different types of punishments, but it was pretty imprecise as to the relationship between the punishment and the crime. There was no precise scalar amount of you do exactly this much and you get this much. And that is really important for getting rid of that lag between the state morality and the people's morality, the state discipline and the people's discipline, is you want people to be instantaneously aware of what kind of punishment they're going to receive for what kind of crime. There is an instantaneous and unambiguous link between I'm going to do this and I'm going to go to prison for this amount of days. Now, obviously, most people don't know exactly what those days are. But the point is that punishment in the modern era is extremely precise. And that notion of precision in and of itself is one of the most key factors that makes modern penality so much more detrimental, so much more totalizing. And this imprecision means that oftentimes, as is the case with a form of discipline that is warlike, is it takes on these grand proportions that become comical, almost sickening. And for example, Foucault mentions a person who says, the murder that is depicted as a horrible crime is repeated in cold blood, remorselessly. So, right, this is something that people point out with the death penalty today, that the state is opposed to murder unless the state gets to murder you for murdering. Just like with the teacher who punishes the kid for punishing another kid, only some forms of punishment are allowed. And this imprecision allows for the hypocrisy of the state to come out more clearly. And finally, it creates martyrs. Think about Jesus. Torture hinged on the presentation of someone who submitted completely to the sovereign, who submitted their body and mind fully to the future discipline that is going to be brought on by the state. But just like Damien failed to curse, Jesus failed to, recant his teachings or whatever. And as a result, this ritual turned into basically an excuse for people to see someone revolting against the state. Foucault mentions in the book that on the days when some famous torture would be done publicly, people would stop working and they would basically go, and their voices were part of, having someone's head chopped off depended on the crowd being all riled up and being like, yes, they deserve this, get them. It's like when we talk about today the death penalty with regards to rapists, and some people are like, yeah, they fucking deserve it, like, get them. This is the kind of mentality that is necessary to penality, is creating that instantaneous sense of basically being involved. Foucault says it was where the law was manifested publicly, where they were called upon to act as witnesses and almost as co-adjudicators of this law, that they could intervene physically, enter by force into the punitive mechanism and redistribute its effects, take up in another sense the violence of the punitive rituals. And that's on page 61 of Discipline and Punish. So, right, people would see this violence and they would see someone who wasn't giving in, and suddenly the violence of the ritual becomes the precondition for violence against the sovereign. So, okay, that's not always going to work. Sometimes that's going to backfire, and we want to eliminate as best as possible that possibility to backfire if we want, if we're thinking in the mind of the sovereign and we want to be successful in our forms of punishment. So taking these criticisms together, Foucault is trying to unearth some of the strategies that made the state change to a form of punishment that we see as more humane. Because think about it. People don't just give up their power. People aren't just benevolent. If they're in a situation where they can use their power, they will use it, and they will go to gargantuan methods and means to ensure that their power will stay. Foucault writes, historians of ideas usually attribute the dream of a perfect society to the philosophers and jurists of the 18th century. But there was also a military dream of society. Its fundamental reference was not to the state of nature, but to the meticulously subordinated cogs of a machine, not to the primal social contract, but to permanent coercions, not to fundamental rights, but to indefinitely progressive forms of training, not to the general will, but to automatic docility. And that notion of automatic docility is essentially the function of the link between the moral conscience of the people and the state. That if that lag can be eliminated and you feel as if you are perfectly represented by the state, that is actually a possible outcome of this automatic docility, of being part of a cog in a machine where you don't realize that you've been totalized in very central ways. These are three pictures that are in Discipline and Punish. The first one is Jeremy Bentham's famous plan of the panopticon. And the panopticon was a style of architecture for a prison, and it was a circular institution with cells around it. It is perfectly geometrical and basically cellularizes every person in the institution. In the center, there's a watchtower. And this watchtower is such that it rises above each of the cells, where the people in the cells can't see who is in the watchtower, or even if there is somebody there at all. But the watchtower can see all the people from above. And this is really the height of that instantaneous apprehension of knowledge, which Foucault sees as so problematic. That because knowledge and power are linked, here, the very power of the discipline in the panopticon is not any physical torture of any kind, but it is merely the possibility of being known, and being known so completely and totally, that at any point, you are essentially being watched. And of course, that's a scary enough notion for people walking in the dark in the woods to be scared about just being watched. And we see a very similar instantiation of this in a penitentiary in Stateville here in the US, with that central panoptic tower, where everyone can be viewed, and it could be you who's next, right? And then this is Fresnes prison in France, where people are being taught the evils of alcoholism. And they're in these little cells, which, just like I mentioned in the panopticon, this is a form of discipline which focuses on cellularizing people. Basically, finding a space in which they can act and optimizing and controlling that space, and in so doing, controlling expression and autonomy itself. Now, one of Foucault's most provocative points is that because of this, modern discipline is not more humane. Foucault says what was emerging, no doubt, was not so much a new respect for the humanity of the condemned, as a tendency towards a more finely tuned justice, towards a closer penal mapping of the social body. So think about the prison as a sort of body. And the goal of the state is to look at this body and map it very clearly just by knowing it. And by doing that, articulate each movement of every organ of the body as if it was something imposed from above. That in fact, this shift towards surveillance and teaching and methods of practicing certain virtues or whatever, this is actually just more finely tuned justice. He argues that the reform movement that moved from torture to prisons, it was not about being disgusted about the atrocity of punishment as an idea in and of itself. It was a disgust of a badly regulated distribution of power. Like I said, the state or whoever is in power wants to maintain that power. And thus, what is most disgusting to them is not the fact that they have to go to these means, but the fact that sometimes they don't work. And thus, just like I mentioned earlier, modern discipline's trick is the notion that it is interfering less, that it is disciplining less. Rather than disciplining less, and this is a quote from Foucault, it disciplines better and in a more diffuse and omnipotent manner. And he calls punishment a political investment of the body, which is concerned with the body politic as a set of material elements and techniques that serve as weapons, relays, communications routes, and supports for the power and knowledge relations that invest human bodies and subjugate them by turning them into objects of knowledge. So Foucault is painting in a very sinister light being an object of knowledge at all. That in the carceral apparatus, people do not become individuals in the sense of autonomous people which should be intervened with as least as possible. Rather, they are objects of knowledge. They become a weapon of the state. They become a relay, a communication tower of sorts, a line connecting from one piece to the other in this body politic, this social body as such. Now, I'm calling modern carceral institutions, prisons, maybe even you could look at militaries or schools, as a penal technopolitics. Foucault calls this a microphysics of power. Deleuze and Guattari call this micropolitics. But there are a number of methods that are used by modern disciplinary apparatuses that are actually a lot more sinister. For example, in the same vein as people becoming objects of knowledge, they become sheer operational parameters, something to be adjusted like a synthesizer, for example, a synthesizer is a musical instrument that was created to finely tune every single parameter of the creation of sound. What type of wave is it? Its amplitude, its frequency, what have you, repetition in relation to other frequencies. And Foucault says that modern discipline is about, quote, exercising upon it, the body, a subtle coercion of obtaining holds upon it at the level of the mechanism itself, movements, gestures, attitudes, rapidity, an infinitesimal power over the active body. So, right, the body becomes a bunch of parameters, of movements to be controlled, of gestures to be seized, of attitudes to be shifted and corrected. Think about the idea of a correctional facility. It's all about correcting. And thus, it also, like we talked about with surveillance, has an omnipresence to it. It's about maximizing knowledge itself as a form of power. It's uninterrupted, constant coercion that partitions as closely as possible time, space, and movement. And thus we see in that timetable at the very beginning of the lecture, this partitioning of time, space, and movement. It's about taking an order like a drum roll and having it be instantly connected to some sort of action which is done out of habit. And this has some very sinister and interesting ties to, for example, behavioralism in psychology. That you can reinforce a behavior in, for example, a rat, and you put a rat in a cage and you have it where when it pushes a button with its nose, it gets food. And it'll just start pushing that button all the time. And even when you don't have it get food, it'll still push the button. Or if you have that button administer a controlled shock over time, the rat will recede away from that part of the cage entirely. So optimizing through knowledge alone, time, space, and movement is one of these key strategies. And the body, as such, is not just something that the state innocently understands. It's a question of, are you succumbing to a model or a code, or are you deviating? The body is basically this mass, this lump, which is to be corrected. And how do you do this? You implement some kind of code of proper behaviors, or of the ideal citizen, of the ideal housewife, of the ideal brother, of the ideal child of God, which basically overcodes any sense of deviance. And this is done through, repetition, through constant surveillance, giving that pressure to change. And Foucault has a really awesome quote. I mean, it's one of my favorite quotes that I've ever heard, where he basically says, the man described for us, whom we are invited to free, is already in himself the effect of a subjection much more profound than himself. A soul inhabits him and brings him to existence, which is itself a factor in the mastery that power exercises over the body. The soul is the effect and instrument of a political anatomy. The soul is the prison of the body. And this is something which Foucault is just using to talk about kind of the moral conscience in general. It's that home which is internal to the mind. And this is the will, the desires, the habits. Foucault mentions that since punishment is no longer about the body, it must be about the soul. He says the expiation that once rained down upon the body must be replaced by a punishment that acts in depths on the heart, the thoughts, the will, the inclinations. So there's basically this internal world of subjectivity, of you differ on your favorite flavor of ice cream, or what kind of things you like to do in your free time, or, I don't know, the kind of music you like. And the goal here is to essentially create this soul. This soul has nothing inherently deviant about it or correct about it until power imposes upon it what is deviant, what is correct, what is your ideal mode of function. And all this takes on a very economic perspective. When punishment turns into a question of taking this body, which has been manufactured, and this soul, which is being coded through knowledge and through the fine-tuning of parameters, to take all this and optimize it. The individual basically becomes a concern of power as an economic diffusion of itself. It becomes a question of optimizing the individual as something which is going to reproduce the state's ideals. It's going to reproduce those ideas of virtue or of the American dream. And by doing this, I mean, this is kind of how capitalism works in general, is that what is important in terms of looking at the citizen from an economic lens is whether or not they are profitable, whether or not their labor is optimized, whether or not a market is optimized or diversifying. So all this takes punishment to an economic level where you are essentially alienated and reduced to an economic factor. And all of this comes together to get rid of that lag, or rather to minimize as best as possible that lag. Because there always needs to be a little bit of lag between you shouldn't do something and I'm thinking about doing it. There always has to be a little bit of lag there because, of course, if there is complete similarity, then you'd be the exact same thing. Part of the thing that makes a law so terrifying, so imposing, so respected, is that it comes from without. It's something imposed upon you. It's a punishment that you wouldn't possibly put on yourself if you had to, or if you had the choice to, but it's being imposed upon you. So you want to minimize that lag that separates the individual from the state, such that the subject itself becomes a juridical subject, which is to say a subject under the law. You become nothing but basically this reproduced little model that the state has made for you. I hope this has been useful in terms of getting at some of Foucault's ideas, seeing how they relate to our life, and maybe thinking about, how does discipline play a role in my life? I hope you'll check out some of my other lectures on postmodernism, on Foucault specifically, Nietzsche, German idealism, feminism. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.